All right, hello everyone and welcome back. Today what we're going to do in this video, or perhaps two videos, is apply these concepts of discourse community and the public sphere, which can be broken into separate publics. And we're going to take the basic ideas, some of which you see in front of you for discourse community. Those 6 are fairly clear. The public sphere reading and the idea of the public sphere in general has a lot more going on. I'll give you, a number that you can use because both discourse communities and publics are theoretical, but you can use them to analyze language, to figure out what's going on here. Why is this group doing what they do? Why and how do they do it? What are the motivations? How are they influenced by the other groups that they're competing or cooperating with? And as well, then, how do they have sort of a language that they return to? As we see here, a specific lexis. Lexis is simply, basically, the Greek word for style. Right, we get the word lexicon from that, which is a synonym for vocabulary, but a fairly specific vocabulary, and maybe we could even say rhetorical persuasive frameworks that they repeat. And that would be good too. So the first thing we'll look at here, we'll just turn this into an analytical lens, has a broadly agreed set of common public goals. We can see that all over this page, of course, and web writing is good for this, which is why I've chosen web writing. Essays, can be a little more challenging because they don't have so much and so many different types of writing inside of them. But we'll open up with the easier things to analyze here. So again, we're looking for, has a broadly agreed set of common public goals. We could look all over for that. I'm going to suggest one place we see that right here. 1, 2, 3. 3 major programs, right? They've got others as well you could take a look at. But we get what their values are right here. Their common goals, well, something to do with clean energy, getting beyond fossil fuel energy, something to preserve or conserve wild America, whether that be keeping, a clean environment, maybe that's a toxin and chemical free environment, maybe that's protecting public lands from, say, private ownership, industry moving in on them being sold off by the government to make money, something like this, preserving national parks for hiking, whatever it may be. And something similar to that, but a little bit different, enjoying the outdoors, which might simply be you don't have much of an attitude about saving the environment, but you do love to bike and hike and spend time outside. And so this is, a different goal, maybe even we might say a different audience or community in some ways. But you can see they've got some major goals here. And you could believe in one of these things, and that doesn't mean that you believe in the other two. But to be a member of this group, you must, to some extent, they imagine that you enjoy all of these things. Although you might just enjoy the outdoors, and maybe what the Sierra Club wants to do is get you on board with these other things where you're a bit more activist and thinking about clean energy and climate change and things like this. But so we could see that's just one easy way to see number 1 here. We keep looking, has mechanisms of intercommunication amongst its members. Well, here's an easy one. Again, there's lots of places on here. We could find this if we look through, but we can see that there are local committee meetings, and they're listed here. Because we're close to Rochester, we can see where the Rochester monthly meeting is. Clearly, people are meeting and talking about local goals. What's the Sierra Club, this chapter, going to do in this section of Minnesota, for instance, right? And so we can see that. And so these people actually have face-to-face meetings. They're not just people who read the web because they're interested in nature writing or something like this. Rather, they're meeting and putting together social activist work. So that's one easy area where we can go. And we can see that this is nationwide, of course, too. So it seems to qualify for number 2 here as well. Sierra Club is looking a lot like a discourse community. Uses its participatory mechanisms primarily to provide information and feedback. Again, we could look here. We probably do want to look here. Well, what type of things are happening here? These are probably groups of people that are meeting with each other members, to talk about the goals, what they consider the biggest environmental threats, or moments of opportunity to do some of these things, preservation, moving to clean energy in the Rochester area, right? But they might also be meeting with, we won't actually click and take a look, but we can just imagine they're probably meeting with local government officials. They're probably talking to other environmental groups. They might be talking to, if we're thinking Rochester, Mayo Clinic, and trying to convince Mayo Clinic to, do solar power or go greener than they currently are, or do something like this, right? Or maybe to sponsor a program for kids enjoying the outdoors, whatever it may be. But clearly they're not just talking to each other. The useful information and feedback is member to member, but also to people outside of the group that are interested parties. Utilizes and hence possesses one or more genres. Well, we can see that here. Remember, a genre, if you're not familiar with the term, it simply means type or form, basically. So it's a form or type of writing. If we look through here, we see all kinds of things. We can see, since it's the internet, the take action buttons. We've seen this type of thing on many, many pages. That could be seen as a genre. Usually we think of genre as something more like this. These are basically news stories written by the Sierra Club, right? How the honeybee buzz hurts wild bees, right? So it sounds like a newspaper article to a great extent. Here's one that's a little bit different than that. This one sounds kind of informational. This one sounds more like a personal essay, which is a slightly different genre, right? Even though they might have a lot of the same things going on, conflict and characters and a lot of emotion, perhaps, or something like this, at least for the Promised Land. But this sounds like a memoir, someone traveling west and he fell in love with the American West back in '85 here. So these are all different types of genres that they use member to member and maybe to communicate with groups or get new members into their groups. But we can see that they have a lot of genres and they're using them repeatedly. Right. If we wanted to look at this, I find this pretty fascinating. If we want to look at other things that they do repeatedly, like use logos, well, there's plenty of logos going on here, but there's also, I would suggest, some emotion, some pathos. If we look at this, this is Scott Pruitt, the head of the EPA. He used to sue the EPA to try to stop them from regulating. And in a strange turn of events, in the Trump administration, he is now the head of the EPA, the very organization he used to sue. And so the Sierra Club not very happy about that, as you can tell. So it's time to boot Pruitt. Well, there's no logic there. It's just, anger and emotion, and they hope that you already know the backstory to Pruitt and are ready to support that. And here's another little bit that's basically pathos emotion. Scott Pruitt's dirty dealings are putting us in danger. He's unfit to lead. They don't explain why. He must go. Why? Well, they assume you know, and they're playing on our emotions here. Right. So we can see the Sierra Club also has, and I can tell you from having read this before, a lot of this type of stuff. They have some villains, we might say, that they go after. And when they do so, it's not always logically necessarily. But if we want to look at something different here, we could say that this section is an appeal to logos. Why should I join you? Well, they got a lot of stats going on here. Look at, they got 3 million people. They've retired 251 coal plants, and their goal to provide the world clean energy. Here, if we want to take a quick look at the honeybee piece, again, if this video ages, this may not be here anymore. But if we take a look at this, I can tell you from reading through it, it's mainly logos. It's a lot of interviews with scientific experts, experts with bees, a lot of stats. We can see that in this section right here. We've got the decline of bees, the number of bees species that have gone extinct, declined 96%, 50% of Midwestern, loaded with stats, and that usually points toward logos. We got an expert right down here, a scientist from U of Cambridge, right? So this is an article. It sounds like a newspaper, but it's very logos driven, which is very different than what we saw back here just a moment ago with this type of rhetoric. Dirty dealings are putting us in danger, and that's all it says, right? So we can see that Sierra Club has a very definitive mix that it uses all the time on its website. If you looked at this at a different moment in time, you would see the same types of things. All right, so that's what we've got here. One or more genres in communicative furtherance of its aims. In addition to these genres or common ways of writing, has acquired some specific lexis. We could, again, there's lots we could look at. But one thing we could look at would be sort of we might almost call it poetic stuff here. It's alliteration, right? If you're an English major, remember that's from high school. Dirty dealings, danger, all those D's, right? Sounds almost Shakespearean in some way. So there's a very specific lexis. Again, we could see that if we went down to the essay, the naturalist essay, the nature essay, right? And it sounds, it's usually based upon falling in love with nature in some way. It has some repeated sort of tropes, some things that all these essays do. This is never going to be a complaint about nature or not being fun or there being too many mosquitoes or something like this, right? It's always going to be falling in love with nature. So there's a very specific lexis and things that you say if you're the Sierra Club, right? So they seem to meet number 5. Has a threshold level of members with a suitable degree of relevant content and expertise. So plenty of scientists here. We saw them cited in the few things we looked at, right? If we took a longer look at this, we would see that there's plenty of people in government or plenty of government groups involved that meet with the Sierra Club. and ask them for regional goals and this type of thing. So we can see all that in here too. We won't spend a lot of time on it, but it is certainly there, and we can find that there are people who have content expertise on ecological systems, the environment, these type of things, but also they are quite expert in the way they write, discoursal expertise, right? That we can think of as rhetorical expertise, and again, all the different ways that the Sierra Club repeatedly uses language. So ta-da! That is definitely the hallmark of a discourse community, right? Now, if we want to look at something slightly different, because it seems like maybe everything could be a discourse community, sometimes it's a little harder to see. We can take a look at this one. This is a letter to the editor, which is doing much of the same thing. It's got a point, right? It's political in some way. It has an opinion. It's argumentative. Here's a very, very short one. You can read it quick if you'd like in the New York Times, but we can ask some of these questions here to see, is this a discourse community, or is this person writing as a member of a discourse community? Has a broadly agreed upon set of common public goals? Well, if this person does, if John Stafford does, we don't know what group he's part of. We don't know who he belongs to. We don't know who the other members are. We don't know if they also speak like him. So although we probably could find a lot of people in the U.S. that have this opinion, this doesn't seem to be an organized group in any way. And if we look at some of these other things, has mechanisms of intercommunication amongst members? Not really. There's nothing here that even mentions other people who agree with him. This seems to be a sole voice with an opinion, even if it is an opinion shared by millions. But it's not organized in the way the Sierra Club was. The Sierra Club is a network of people working together, right? If we think of additional genres and all of these type of things, we simply don't get that. We don't know if John here will ever write anything like this again, right? This might have been a one-shot type of opinion sent off and published, and he might not think about this much again, or at least write about it much again, and maybe not with other people. So we can see where something like this, a letter to the editor, all of these things are perhaps implied, or we could find a group, a sort of an anti-war group, I suppose, that meets these criteria. But the letter to the editor here probably doesn't do those things. And so we can see that we would not say that this belongs to a discourse community, or at least an easy to decipher discourse community. We could see elements. We could go through and say, okay, what would a discourse community have if it had this opinion, sort of an anti-war movement or an anti-war discourse community, and what type of things would it need to have? What might its language sound like? What would its specific lexis see? What types of feedback mechanisms would they have, and all these type of things. So there's probably a group out there like that, but this letter is not from that group. And so at best, this is sort of implied rather than specific, like the Sierra Club was. So that's kind of how discourse communities work. You can see how they're very, very powerful. They help you see things that you might not bother to look for. If we think of the Sierra Club and just the few things I pointed out fairly quickly, we probably wouldn't have noticed those things necessarily, or at least we wouldn't have looked for those things in a targeted manner. But yet there they are, right? So these six can really help us amp up our analysis of writing. And, it helped us figure out something about the letter to the editor too, and how it's sort of circulating inside of a network, or not a network, maybe, right? And we could look at it that way too and say this really isn't very networked, even if this opinion is shared by millions. So it's sort of a lack of a network, or a lack of a group advocating for this type of stance, which is interesting in itself too. Sierra Club will probably get farther because it is highly organized and highly networked. John Stafford here, because he's not connected to anything, probably won't get very far and will need a group of people and a number of decades to get his movement going in many ways, right? Another way to look at this, if we look at this as protest, you probably need to have these things to be successful. If you looked at movements that pop up that are protest movements and they can't do all of these things, there's probably less of a chance they'll be successful. They will just be sort of a small voice in the wind, like John Stafford from the New York Times. His letter appears and is gone in an instant. You've probably got to have these six things for continuity and longevity and all the things that a protest movement wants. So if a movement doesn't meet these six, or doesn't have these six things going, it might not be very successful. It probably can't compete in the public sphere against other communities who want different things. The opposition, so to speak, if you wanted to think of it that way. All right, so that is discourse community. Next, we're going to move on and talk about the public sphere and analyze that to extend our ability to use discourse communities and publics as a form of analysis. All right, we will see you for part 2 in a second.